70 Christians beheaded in a single church attack
Yeah.
um, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a headline that just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's easy to just get caught up in the sheer scale of the tragedy. But we're going beyond the headlines today.
Yeah.
You and I are going to dive deep into the story behind those numbers,
Yeah.
the context of this horrific event and what it means for the people involved.
Absolutely.
So we're using a recent article from Christian Culture News titled Tragedy in the DRC, the beheading of 70 Christians in a church attack, published on February 26, 2025.
Okay.
Now, the DRC is a predominantly Christian nation with over 95% identifying as such.
Wow.
So this attack, really hits home, raising the question, what could lead to such a targeted act of violence?
What's striking is how this event intertwines with the DRC's history, its religious landscape, and the ongoing struggles that the country faces. It's not just an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of deeper, more systemic issues that we need to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's paint a picture of what happened March 28th, 2023, a Sunday. A church in Ituri province is holding its service, a place of peace and community.
Right.
And suddenly masked attackers storm in, armed with machetes and firearms.
Oh my gosh.
It's a scene of unimaginable terror, people desperately trying to escape the violence.
And these weren't just random attackers. The article points to the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF.
Right.
But to really grasp their motives, we need to dig into who they are and what drives them. While they're often labeled as a religious extremist group, there might be more to the story. Could they be exploiting the conflict for resources, or are they even a proxy force for other players in the region? There's a level of complexity here that needs further examination.
Yeah, and it's chilling. And the article brings home the human cost by sharing a survivor's testimony. Imagine the trauma of witnessing such brutality, the grief of losing friends and loved ones, the fear that lingers long after the attack.
It's unimaginable.
This is not just a news story. These
Yeah.
are real lives shattered by violence.
Exactly, and that trauma extends beyond the immediate victims. The source captures the ripples of grief and outrage that spread through the community. But there's also a sense of vulnerability, a fear that's rooted in the DRC's history of violence against Christians. This wasn't the first time,
Right.
and it sadly may not be the last.
The article doesn't shy away from that historical context, referencing events like the First and Second Congo Wars. Those conflicts were devastating, with widespread violence against civilians, including Christians. It's a reminder that this attack didn't occur in a vacuum, and understanding the past helps us grasp the present.
The article also highlights how armed groups exploit the chaos and instability that often follows such conflicts. Religion becomes a tool, a way to divide communities and consolidate power. It's a stark reminder that faith, unfortunately, can be twisted and used for nefarious purposes.
So where does this leave the Congolese government and military? The article mentions their efforts to provide security and combat these armed groups. But are they doing enough?
The article presents a nuanced view, and you're right to question whether the government's efforts are sufficient. They face an uphill battle. Limited resources, vast territory, and reports of corruption within their ranks. It's like trying to contain a wildfire with a garden hose.
Right.
They might make progress in some areas, but the flames keep spreading. It raises the question of international responsibility. Has the global community failed the DRC? What more could be done to support stability and security in the region?
Yeah, it's a question worth considering, for sure.
Absolutely.
It feels like a hopeless situation, when you consider all those challenges. But the article doesn't just dwell on the darkness. It highlights these incredible stories of survival and resilience within the Christian community in the DRC.
Yeah, those stories offer a glimmer of hope, a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of such horrific violence. It shows us the power of faith, community, and that determination to rebuild and heal. They're a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of despair.
Yeah, absolutely. The article mentions this one pastor who, despite witnessing the attack, organized prayer vigils and counseling sessions for the families of the victims. That takes immense strength and compassion.
It's truly inspiring. These acts of resilience remind us that even amidst suffering, there's a capacity for healing, for finding meaning and purpose. It's not about forgetting the pain or minimizing the tragedy, but rather about recognizing the potential for hope and renewal.
And these stories aren't just important for those directly affected by the attack, right? They serve as a call to action for all of us,
Yeah.
inspiring us to contribute in whatever way we can to a world where such violence is unthinkable.
Absolutely. We may not be able to single-handedly solve the complex issues in the DRC, but we can choose to be informed, to be compassionate, and to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering. And we can advocate for change.
Speaking of change, the article talks about the need for greater international awareness and action. It mentions the work of organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who are advocating for human rights and pushing for investigations into these attacks. What are your thoughts on the role of international pressure in situations like this?
International pressure is crucial. It can help hold perpetrators accountable, shine a light on human rights abuses, and provide much-needed support for those working on the ground to bring about change. These organizations play a vital role in amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized and overlooked.
It also mentions religious bodies around the world expressing solidarity with the victims and calling for prayers.
While it might seem like a small gesture, those expressions of solidarity and prayer can have a significant impact. They demonstrate a shared humanity, a recognition of the suffering of others, and those prayers can translate into action, inspiring people to get involved, advocate for change, and demand accountability from their elected officials. It all contributes to a growing movement for justice and peace.
So going back to the DRC's own efforts, the article mentions some steps the government and military are taking to combat armed groups and provide security. But it also highlights the criticisms leveled against them, the challenges they face, and the allegations of corruption. It's a mixed bag, and it's hard to gauge how effective their actions truly are.
You've hit on a critical point. The situation is incredibly complex. While the government might have the right intentions, their efforts are often hampered by limited resources, logistical difficulties, and, as you mentioned, corruption within their ranks. It's a system struggling to function effectively in a highly challenging environment.
That complexity makes it even more important for us to avoid making simplistic judgments or generalizations. This isn't a black and white situation. There are many shades of gray.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to delve into the nuances, to examine the various factors at play, and to understand the perspectives of all involved.
The article briefly touches on the global community's response. Do you think there's a sense of indifference towards what's happening in the DRC, and if so, why?
It's a difficult question. There's no doubt that the DRC has often been overlooked on the world stage. Part of it might stem from a lack of awareness. Conflicts in Africa don't always receive the same level of media attention as those in other parts of the world. There's also the issue of compassion fatigue.
Right.
The world is bombarded with news of crises and conflicts, and it can be overwhelming to process it all.
It's like we become desensitized to the suffering of others, especially when it feels distant or unfamiliar.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to actively engage with these stories, to learn about the people and communities affected, and to remind ourselves that these are real lives with real consequences.
And it's not just about awareness, right? There needs to be concrete action, tangible support from the international community.
Absolutely.
There needs to be a commitment to addressing the root causes of the conflict, supporting peace-building initiatives, investing in development, and holding those responsible for human rights abuses accountable. The article doesn't offer any easy solutions. It leaves us with a lot to ponder. It feels like the situation in the DRC is a microcosm of larger global issues: conflict, poverty, exploitation.
You're absolutely right. It's a reminder that these issues are interconnected. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the globe. We're all part of a larger human family, and we have a shared responsibility to address these challenges.
So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
That's a question that requires careful consideration, and it's something we'll explore further as we wrap up our deep dive into this tragedy.
It can feel overwhelming to think about solutions on a global scale. Like, where do we even begin to address these complex issues? It's easy to feel powerless.
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that even small actions can have a ripple effect. The article gives us some concrete starting points. It talks about the power of raising awareness, educating ourselves and others about what's happening in the DRC. Sharing this very deep dive, for instance, could spark conversations and inspire others to get involved.
It's like that saying, your knowledge is power. The more we understand the complexities of this situation, the better equipped we are to advocate for meaningful change.
Precisely. And beyond raising awareness, we can support organizations that are working on the ground in the DRC. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are doing crucial work in documenting human rights abuses, providing legal aid, and advocating for justice. Even a small donation can make a big difference.
It's about putting our values into action. If we believe in human rights, in peace, and in justice, we have a responsibility to support those who are fighting for those values on the front lines.
And there are other ways to contribute as well. The article mentions the importance of contacting our elected officials, urging them to prioritize the DRC in their foreign policy agendas. We can demand that our governments provide more humanitarian aid support, peace-building initiatives, and hold those responsible for violence accountable. Our voices collectively can have a significant impact.
It reminds me of the quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing." Silence is complicity, and we have a moral obligation to speak out against injustice.
Well said. And remember, even small acts of kindness and compassion can make a difference. The article talks about the power of prayer, of sending messages of support to those affected by the violence. It might seem like a small gesture, but it can provide comfort and encouragement to those who are struggling.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're all connected, and our actions, however small, can ripple outwards and create positive change.
And ultimately, that's the message we want you to take away from this deep dive. The situation in the DRC is complex, the challenges are immense, but there is always hope, and there's always something we can do to contribute to a more just and compassionate world.
This deep dive started with a horrific tragedy, a headline that shook us to our core. But it's also a story of resilience, of the strength of the human spirit and the power of collective action.
We've explored the historical context, delved into the complexities of the conflict, and examined the challenges and potential solutions. Now we leave you with a choice. What role will you play in shaping a better future? Remember, even small actions can make a difference.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.